Everyone knows the image of Rosie the Riveter, the iconic poster with the slogan, "We can do it." But what if I told you the real story of Rosie and the women she represented didn't end with World War II? Most people think these women simply stepped aside when the men came home, returning to domestic life. But that's not what happened. The real Rosies, the millions of women who worked in factories and shipyards during the war, didn't just build planes and tanks. They laid the groundwork for a seismic shift in the American economy and workforce. So why is this part of the story so rarely told? And what does it reveal about the enduring impact of these women on the post-war transformations of America? Let's uncover the truth behind the silent legacy of Rosie the Riveters. When people think of Rosie the Riveter, they picture a wartime icon, a patriotic call for women to step into factory jobs while the men went off to fight. It's a feel-good story, right? Women temporarily filling in, keeping the war effort alive, and then gracefully stepping back into domestic roles when the soldiers returned. This narrative has been cemented by movies, books, and even school curriculums. The iconic poster and slogan, "We can do it," reinforce the idea that Rosie's role was temporary, a wartime necessity, not a lasting revolution. But here's the problem. This version of the story is oversimplified and frankly misleading. While many women did leave their jobs when the war ended, a significant number didn't. In fact, millions of women stayed in the workforce, not just because they wanted to, but because they had to. The war had shifted the economic landscape so dramatically that returning to the pre-war norm wasn't an option for many families. The misconception persists because it's convenient. The idea of women quietly stepping back into traditional roles fits a post-war narrative of stability and normalcy. But the reality is far more complex and far more revolutionary. The truth is, Rosie the Riveters didn't just support the war effort, they kick-started a cultural and economic transformation that reshaped America long after the war ended. Let's explore how in the next section. Here's the truth. Rosie the Riveters didn't fade into the background after World War II. They transformed the American economy and workforce in ways that are still felt today. During the war, over 6 million women joined the industrial workforce, taking on roles that were traditionally reserved for men. They didn't just prove they could rivet, weld, and assemble. They showed that women were capable of excelling in high-skill, high-pressure jobs. This wasn't just a temporary solution for wartime production. It was a revelation that changed how America viewed labor forever. But here's where the hot take comes in. Even after the war ended and the men returned home, the impact of these women didn't disappear. Many women resisted the pressure to leave their jobs, recognizing that their contributions were essential to their families and communities. By 1950, women made up almost 30% of the workforce, a sharp increase from the pre-war years, and their influence went beyond numbers. These women redefined workplace dynamics, pushing for better wages, safer working conditions, and greater opportunities. They laid the groundwork for the labor movements and feminist advocacy that followed in the decades to come. This shift makes sense when you think about it. Rosie the Riveters didn't just build planes, they built confidence, independence, and a new understanding of what women could achieve in the workforce. The war may have been the catalyst, but their impact was anything but temporary. So why does the narrative still focus on Rosie as a wartime symbol, rather than a post-war pioneer? Let's dig deeper into the overlooked contributions and challenges these women faced in the next section. Here's where the story gets even more interesting. The legacy of Rosie the Riveters wasn't just about breaking into the workforce, it was about changing the trajectory of entire industries and redefining societal norms. Take the manufacturing sector, for example. During the war, women didn't just fill roles, they mastered them. By 1944, women made up 35% of the workforce in aircraft manufacturing and were celebrated for their efficiency and precision. This wasn't just a temporary stopgap. Their performance forced employers and unions to rethink their assumptions about gender and skill. And it wasn't just about factories. The war opened doors for women in professions like engineering, clerical work, and even scientific research, fields that had long been dominated by men. While many women faced pressure to step aside post-war, a significant number stayed and paved the way for future generations of women in STEM fields. Here's where the misconception becomes deliberate. Society at the time wasn't ready to embrace this change fully. The government and media actively promoted the idea of women returning to the home, portraying it as their patriotic duty. But this didn't align with reality. Women who had tasted financial independence and professional success weren't eager to give it up. So, why didn't they push back harder against the narrative? Because many had to navigate a delicate balance. They knew that keeping their jobs required proving that they could belong in the workforce without upsetting societal norms too much. In other words, they had to downplay their contributions to avoid becoming targets of backlash. This silent contribution is what makes their legacy so powerful and so misunderstood. By quietly staying in the workforce, pushing for change from within, and proving their worth day by day, these women reshaped America's economy and culture without ever demanding the spotlight. In the next sections, we'll explore the concrete ways they influenced the post-war economy and laid the foundation for the feminist movements that followed. The impact of Rosie the Riveters extended far beyond the war years. Women's contributions during World War II fundamentally reshaped the American workforce, creating ripple effects that lasted for generations. Let's start with wages. Before the war, women's labor was largely undervalued, with most confined to low-paying, low-skilled jobs. However, during the war, the demand for skilled workers meant that women began earning higher wages in traditionally male-dominated roles. This shift wasn't just about money, it was about proving that women's work was just as valuable as men's. By the time the war ended, millions of women had gained a sense of financial independence. For many, returning to lower-paying domestic roles simply wasn't an option anymore. Even in the face of societal pressure, women stayed in the workforce, taking up jobs in clerical work, teaching and nursing, industries that saw significant growth in the post-war years. And then there was the impact on unions. During the war, women joined unions in record numbers, pushing for better wages and safer working conditions. This involvement helped expand labor protections that benefited all workers, not just women. These contributions weren't a footnote in history, they were a foundation. The Rosie generation showed that women could be economic powerhouses, changing the American workplace forever. Rosie the Riveters didn't just transform the economy, they also helped spark a cultural shift in how society viewed women's roles. Before the war, women were largely confined to domestic spheres. The idea of a woman operating heavy machinery or managing production lines was unthinkable to many, but Rosie changed all that. During the war, images of women in overalls and welding masks became symbols of strength, competence, and patriotism. Even after the war, those images didn't disappear. They lingered in the public consciousness, planting the seeds for the feminist movements of the 1960s and 70s. Women began to see themselves not just as homemakers, but as contributors to society in broader ways. This shift also had an intergenerational impact. The daughters of Rosies grew up watching their mothers work outside the home, gaining a new perspective on what women could achieve. Many of these women went on to become the trailblazers of the women's liberation movement, fighting for equal pay, workplace rights, and educational opportunities. The Rosies may not have marched in protests or demanded sweeping reforms, but their quiet defiance of traditional gender roles was revolutionary. They didn't just change the way people worked, they changed the way people thought about work. While Rosie the Riveters made incredible strides, their journey wasn't without struggle. Many women faced hostility when they entered the workforce. Men resented their presence, fearing competition, and some unions even excluded women altogether. After the war, the challenges only grew. Employers pressured women to leave their jobs, and government propaganda urged them to return to domestic roles to make room for the returning men. Those who stayed often found themselves stuck in lower-paying, less respected positions despite proving their capabilities during the war. There was also the intersection of race. While white women were celebrated as roses in propaganda, women of color who worked in factories during the war faced even greater barriers. They were often segregated into the lowest paying jobs and excluded from many of the opportunities that white women enjoyed. Despite these challenges, the legacy of the Rosie generation endured. They paved the way for future battles, from the Equal Pay Act of 1963 to Title IX in 1972. Their work wasn't just a contribution to the war effort, it was a stepping stone toward greater equality for all women in the workforce. The story of Rosie the Riveters is so much more than a wartime slogan or an iconic poster. These women didn't just step into factories, they stepped into history, proving their worth in industries that had long excluded them. And while their contributions are often framed as temporary, the truth is that Rosie and her peers transformed the American economy and laid the groundwork for a cultural shift that would spark the feminist movements of the 20th century. Their legacy isn't just about what they did during the war, it's about what they continued to do after it. From staying in the workforce despite societal pressures to inspiring future generations to fight for equality, the Rosies of World War II ignited a transformation that ripples through our workplaces and culture to this day. And here's the takeaway: progress often starts quietly. The women who kept America running during the war weren't looking for recognition, they were just doing what needed to be done. But their silent contributions changed the course of history, proving that real revolutions often begin with ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. If you found this dive into Rosie the Riveter's enduring impact fascinating, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories about the untold forces that shape our world. Let's honor their legacy by continuing to fight for equality and opportunity everywhere.